Next on the list is Lance Yohe, Red River Basin Commission, long-term flood solutions for the Red River Basin.
Okay, thanks, Gary. Well, thanks for sticking around. Let's try to get at this. I've got some copies of this over here if you want one later. The CD is the full long-term flood report, which is about 3 or 4 inches thick with all the appendices. And I also got a few executive summaries. It's also on our website if you want to get it there. But let me go through and hit some of the high points in the report off the exec summary and talk about this. This effort was funded by Minnesota, North Dakota at the after the 2009 flood. And they came out, the governors came out after the 2009 flood and looked at all the flooding that was going on and said, you know, we really need to get our arms around what's going on out here and get a plan for the future instead of just keep reacting to what's going on. So they gave us some money to do that through the Basin Commission. Each gave us $500,000. We had a lot of consulting help and a lot of people working with us on this, including a lot of people like Moore Engineering and Houston Engineering and all the water boards around the basin on both sides of the river, and the state agencies and the Army Corps of Engineers. In order to make this project work, we wanted a lot of people involved, so we had a lot of committees. We had an oversight committee, we had a technical committee, a policy committee, an economic committee, an impediments committee, and we had a lot of public meetings around the basin where we went out and talked to the people who had just been flooded. We had 23 public meetings at the beginning of the process, and we followed up with those at the end of the process. So we asked people what was going on in their backyard, what they thought the problem was, what they thought the solutions were, things they wanted us to know. And then we went back at the end of the 2 years and told them, okay, here's what we're putting in the recommendations. How does that sound? And we got their input that way as well. We had some assumptions as we started this. We started to look at this problem. We said, well, what are some of the things that we need to really think about? We were hearing from legislators in the St. Paul, for instance, just restore all the wetlands and the problems will go away. And we said, well, does that work? And we found out, no, it doesn't. Because the biggest flood we know of was 1826, before the wetlands were drained and there was no farming, and that's the biggest flood that we know of. So that doesn't work. So we had some assumptions, and one of them was, we're not going to change the economic backbone of this region. Agriculture's here, it's going to stay, so we need to figure out how to deal with how we use the land with drainage and all the things that go into that. We also decided that it was impractical to think about moving Fargo out of the floodplain or Grand Forks out of the floodplain. It's just too expensive to do that. But if legislatures want to pass laws that say cities can no longer grow, they could do that. We just don't think they're going to do that. So our assumption was we're going to continue to have development in the areas where we have urban areas. We need to figure out how to protect those areas. Floods are going to continue to occur. We've not seen probably the worst one that we're going to see. So we can expect floods will continue, and someday we're probably going to get a larger one than we've ever had before. We also decided in here that we need to drive this report from local perspective. What do local people want? What are local people willing to pay for? Because all this starts at the local level when we get these strategies in place. It all comes back to money and how much we're willing to pay. And then we have to work it up through the states, through their policies, and through the federal government and their policies. So we said, is it realistic to think we're going to get a big pot of money from somewhere? The answer was no. Is it realistic to think we're going to change all the rules and regulations about how government and agencies do business? We said no. So therefore, our plan builds on what we think is reasonable in terms of money and what the current rules and regulations are. We also need to look at other issues besides just flooding. Water quality is important, water for drought is important, and issues like that. We also said in our report that basically what we've been doing in the past is always reacting to the last flood. So the last flood gets a little larger, now we decide we want to build our protection to that level. So we said, why don't we get ahead of that curve once and set the bar higher? Earlier this month, we had a group of people over here from the Netherlands. and they were interacting with us on stuff that they're doing over there. Right now, they're expanding their river corridor protection so they can fight a 1,250-year flood. And we're still worrying about a 100-year flood here. They hold the ocean back in the Netherlands so they can farm the land, and they hold that ocean back to a 16,000-year event. And we're still talking about 100 years. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So we're saying in our report that we ought to at least think about trying to get Fargo, Grand Forks up to 500 years. Winnipeg's at 700 years now. Fargo's trying to get to 500 years. Then we got Grand Forks tucked in the middle at 250. We're saying that doesn't make any sense, you know? And we're trying to get our communities at least to 100-year protection plus 3 feet of freeboard right now that are in the floodplain, but even that's not enough. We need to get them higher. So the way to get all these communities higher level is to give them 100-year protection in our report, like Pearlie, Hindram, Halston, the communities on the Minnesota side, get the dikes up that high, then get upstream retention. And by getting upstream retention of those communities, you can almost double their protection. It works the same way for Grand Forks. Grand Forks is now at 250. If you get 20% flow reductions upstream of Grand Forks, our models show that you can almost double their protection. It doesn't work as good for Fargo, however, as Chad talked about. And part of that is because the watershed upstream of Fargo is smaller in terms of areas you can hold water back for retention, so you don't get the same cumulative benefits you do at places like Grand Forks and further downstream. So based on that last chart where we're saying some communities, all the communities ought to get to a couple hundred years, rural residents ought to get to 200 years, major communities to 500, who's at that level right now? Right there. Halsted's at 200, Oslo's at 200, Winnipeg's over 500, and West Fargo, parts of West Fargo over 500. Nobody else in the Red River Basin is at those levels. These areas right here are soon going to be all at 100-year. And if we can get the retention to go with that, we can double them. So we got a graph in our report. All the orange ones are these right here. Everybody else is still out of compliance with what we're recommending. So in our report, we have 2 reports. We have a comprehensive report. That's the one that's on the CD. And we have that short legislative report, which is this one right here. And if you want a copy, I've got a few with me. We have recommendations in both of those reports for policymakers, and we're sharing that with legislatures and government and governors' offices at this time, and with watersheds and watershed districts. And we have tools in there that all kinds of graphs and information that can be used. We have one section on background, but it's not just a background of the geography and the river, it's a background of what we've been doing in the past, the efforts that we've attempted. One of the questions we had from legislators in Minnesota is, why haven't you solved the problem if you've been working on it this long? So we wanted to address that question. So in the report, we have a complete list of all the things that have been done since we started doing projects going back to when the federal government used to do a lot of stuff under Soil Conservation Service, and then the Corps, and then it gradually shifted. So the shift has been from federal agencies doing it to local people driving it now with not so much federal involvement. Part 2 is how do we carry out, what are we doing in this report? And then part 3 really gets into the main issues, floodplain management, local flood protection and flow reduction, and then the recommendations at the end. And then we have a lot of technical appendices. There's some really good basin maps, sub-watershed maps in there, things that you might find useful if you're working on water resource issues yourself. Then what we did is we wanted to find out some ideas about reducing flows. And even before this project started, back after the '97 flood, the Red River Basin Commission got some money from Manitoba, North Dakota, Minnesota, and some other sources, and we started building a model on the main stem Red River. Since that time, the Corps has really done a good job of bringing all their models up to speed, and Chad talked to you about those and where we are with that right now. But our model was built on the 1997 flood, and it looked at the 1997 flood and 3 other previous floods to verify the hydrographs, and we asked the 20% flow reduction question. We found out that at the international boundary, if you wanted a 20% flow reduction, you need just under 1 million acre-feet of storage upstream that's perfectly timed. But if you run that through and look at that, oops, that's not right. I'm missing one. If you go down to this part of the graph right in here and look at it, that number will almost double by the time you get the storage upstream, because most of it can't be perfectly timed. So in our report, we're using 1.5 million acre-feet of storage upstream in the watershed somewhere that would probably get you somewhere around a 20% flow reduction at the international boundary. Then we asked each sub-watershed to see if they could meet those 20% flow reduction goals as the water comes out of their sub-watershed. And right now, I'm just showing you the Bois de Sioux, which is on the Minnesota side, a little bit of South Dakota and North Dakota down on the southern end of the valley. And this is just on the Minnesota portion. But Minnesota on their side could get pretty close to getting their goals if they could get some storage in South Dakota to go with what they're planning to do in Minnesota. So these are sites that they are working on right now that they've looked at, same kind of sites that Chad showed you a little bit ago on the wild rice where all these dots were. These are dots on their map with actual acre-feet of storage in each dot, whether it's gated or ungated, how much and what it totals up to. And they ran that through their model and related it to the unsteady flow model we had on the Red River, and they were able to show us, yes, they could get their 20% flow at Breckenridge, Wahpeton, and at Fargo, if they could build all those sites. And they need about 124,000 acre-feet of storage at $1,000 an acre-feet. They need about $124 million to do that. And if you do that, you can see all the way downstream, we have this graph in there. It shows you all of this cumulative storage that we knew of when we started this project and what it relates to at each of these points on the main stem. One of the things we need to do now is take the new models that the Corps developing based on the new LIDAR and update this table based on the new models so we can get realistic numbers, and then we can start to tie them to certain main stem projects like the Fargo Moorhead diversion. Now, what happens if we do all of this? Well, the first thing we have is in this graph is it shows you right here where we are right now. That's not very many people meeting our recommendations on the U.S. side. If we continue to do right now everything that North Dakota and Minnesota are funding currently, like the dike around Pearlie and Georgetown and Shelley, Neilsville, and Climax, and the work in Valley City, Lisbon, Fort Ransom, all the places that we're doing stuff right now with current money, will that get us to the recommendations we have? And the answer is no. It moves everybody's protection a little higher, but it doesn't get them to the number we're throwing out. To get to the number we're throwing out, you need to add retention into that. And if you do that and you get all that retention, you still, and even the Fargo Moorhead diversion, you still got Fargo over here a little bit shy of being able to say we've got actually 500-year protection. They'll be close, but they won't quite be there. And they'll be able to fight it, but they'll have to do emergency measures. So what it tells you is that you can do all the current diking and diversion projects we're planning. You can do all the upstream retention you want, and you're going to start to meet yourself higher and higher at the goals, but there's going to be certain places where you're still going to have to do some things. Breckenridge, Wahpeton will still be not quite at the level we want. Fargo Moorhead won't be quite at the level we want, but we're getting closer to where we need to be. It also tells you that if you look at all this, there is no silver bullet to the problem. There's a whole bunch of things that need to go on simultaneously to get us gradually to the higher level protection that we're recommending legislatures start thinking about. So the other thing we're telling the legislature is if you're going to invest in this the way we've laid it out, it's going to cost you $4.5 billion, 4.3 I think our number is, to get the retention at today's prices for land, to get the Fargo diversion, to get Devil's Lake, all the pieces of Devil's Lake are in here as well, and all the other smaller things that are being worked on. I think the number comes out to $4.3 billion. It's a lot of money. But here's what they're protecting against. They're protecting against roughly a $13 billion loss. If we lose this area to a large flood because we can't successfully fight it, this is the kind of cost that it's going to come back to the state governments. That's a huge cost. So it's worth it from their perspective to start investing in this over time to get us closer and closer to the levels where we can reduce this to a manageable number or zero if possible. So then what we have is a whole bunch of recommendations that very specifically target all these things I've been talking about. They're all laid out, and there's a whole bunch of recommendations in there. And then they're all in there calling for this amount of storage, combining all this stuff together. And then we have a complete graph like this that carries this out for the first 10 years and then for the next 40. So the first 10 years, if we could get half the storage, the Fargo diversion done, and all the current things that we're working on, so that all we have left to do is the remaining storage that we want to get, we could get an awful lot of stuff in this column to zero in terms of the risk for flood damages that we're looking for. So we could make a lot of progress and not have to spend money except on retention over time, unless we want to raise the bar to a higher number than, say, 500 years for Fargo. So that's all in the report. This is kind of the summary graph. And what we're going to be doing on this graph is we're going to be updating this every year for the next 5 years because we think the validity of the plan is good for that long. We're going to keep updating this and reporting it back to legislature and helping them track this, tying it into their funding cycles, and keep them plugged into this so they know exactly where they are, and this is going to be our measuring rod. We've already started doing that with our technical advisory committee, getting ready for the update next January. So that's all I have. Thanks. Oh, we start with biggest risk, Fargo, Moorhead, and Devil's Lake, and then we have these categories in our recommendations. And we're busy now sharing the report with anybody who he can get a chance to share it with.